One of my favorite things about walking in the woods is easily going off trail. I never quite learned my lesson when I get turned around. And normally, this isn't an issue, since most of the woods around here don't amount to much more than clusters of trees. This wasn't a good understanding to carry with me when I went to go visit my cousin in Virginia. One of the very first things I asked to do was to see what the woods were like in the area, and then I was directed to what looked like a modest size of timber. I went in, found some trails, went off trail, and got educated on just how thick woods can really get. My old methods of just continuing on until I ran out of the forest weren't really working. Soon, I was surrounded by curtains of moss and strange sounds I never heard. Even the canopy of leaves overhead was growing so thick that it was beginning to darken a lot. My heart was picking up pace, to the point that I could hear it in my ears. And at this point, I was already heavily prone to anxiety attacks. Something that I would go for walks in the woods to soothe, ironically. The trees seemed like they would go on forever. I stopped to rest at the base of an ancient-looking oak tree, trying to steady my nerves. Not only did it seem to be even darker, but the sheet of thick mist seemed to be rising up from the earth. It was in middle of July. Could this cold, dank weather really even happen, even deep in the forest? The wind picked up, like there was a storm brewing, and this didn't exactly help my anxiety. Getting caught in a downpour while lost was the last thing I wanted. My heart felt like it was a woodpecker. It sounded like laughter deep in the woods, and I know that couldn't be right. I hadn't seen another soul since I stepped foot in, and there I was, hearing what sounded like several voices, laughing all around me. I had to let out a nervous chuckle when I checked my phone, and it had no service. Just like in a bad movie, where the script writers had run out of ideas how to move the plot along. The blind panic that had been building in me finally had nowhere else to go but out, when I started to see shapes emerge from the mist at the edge of my eyesight. Figures that seemed to be wearing long, flowing drapery with hoods. I began screaming. Something horrible was encroaching on me, and I was going to spare no effort to get away. I ran full force into something that knocked me off my feet. It turned out to be my cousin, looking at me like I was a nut. When I took a second to look around, I would have done the same thing. I wasn't in the deep woods anymore. The look on his face begged an explanation, and I told him what I had experienced, that I had gotten lost, and that I apprehensively even told him about the strange people. He just shook his head and told me that the woods I went into was barely big enough to get that thick. But it had been a site used by some local kids that tried to establish their own coven, but failed when the law got involved due to vandalism. They had taken it just a little too far, with even sacrifices of neighborhood pets. And apparently, this is just hearsay, but I guess they tried to murder a child. I spent some time looking at the trees rather suspiciously. We walked, and it didn't take us more than 8 or 9 minutes, which should have been impossible. My cousin volunteered to tell me that he deliberately brought me to a timber that I could not get lost in. I almost wonder about those kids dabbling in the occult, and what they had actually found in their process of having fun. Either I've become delusional, or I had a supernatural experience. Perhaps those same kids had accidentally roused something that didn't take kindly to them failing to keep up their rituals. But again, this is all just speculation, but I cannot refute what I did experience in those woods. Still creepy to this day. I will never forget this place I discovered while out on a solo hiking trip. I was way up in the mountains, and I had not seen another human in nearly a week. It was coming to the end of my trip, and I was enjoying one last good climbing session before heading back to civilization. Now, just as I was nearing the height of the mountain that I was comfortable with, I noticed an opening to what looked like some kind of cave. I am an experienced hiker and in climbing, so I know there are all sorts of creatures out there. However, I choose the times of year and locations of my trips wisely, so I knew it wasn't hibernating or mating season for any serious predators. Shining my light into the opening, I couldn't see any animal or any signs of animal life. However, the place stank. I was standing right there at the entrance to whatever was using it, and it could make my eyes water. Since at the time, I couldn't see any living creature that was going to try and eat me, despite the revolting stench, curiosity had taken over, and I had to know if there was any telltale signs of what species of animal might be in there, or from the way it stank, using it as a giant litter tray. As I stepped into this small cavern, I could not have been more shocked by my findings. There was indeed evidence that something had been living in there. But here's the kicker. It wasn't an animal. It looked like something you might expect from one of the hillbilly serial killer movies, kind of like The Hills Have Eyes. There was some filthy-looking rags, which seemed to be a sort of bed, some tin cans that looked old and rusted, a couple of burnt items, and a couple of what looked to be porn magazines. And worst of all, something that looked very much like bones, large bones. I don't know if a hiker myself went up there, got injured and could not contact anybody, so they crawled into that cave and just lived up there for a bit, until they were maybe rescued, or died. Or was this the home of some messed up mountain man who killed hikers and ate them? I can tell you one thing. I have never gotten down a mountain so fast in my life. I was out there for almost a week, and I never saw or sensed anything or anyone out there with me. Not even once. But it did make me wonder if this was some experienced hunter who was just waiting for me to make a fatal mistake. As far as the bones go, no, I didn't see a skull or any kind of rib cage, and it's not like I encountered a full human skeleton. They were just large bones. I don't think they were from a large animal. They did look human, but I didn't take time to thoroughly observe them. Anyway, that's one of my creepy encounters while out hiking solo. I used to say that going to the woods was like going to church. One time, entirely by accident, that became very literal. All I know is that I was going for a stroll in a local nature preserve before I had to pack it in and return home from a business trip. It was nothing like the nature preserves back home in the Midwest, that were mostly expanses of prairie grass. The preserve in question was super densely packed woods, where being scrawny was almost a requirement just for movement inside the thicket. And I barely qualified, I feel. I was getting a head rush over the super clean and fragrant air when I saw something among the upper levels of the trees that actually was not a tree. It looked to be something made of cobblestone. Squeezing my way closer, it turned out to be the stone husk of what was left of some kind of church. I literally felt the thrill of archaeology go through me. The place that I'd found looked and felt like it was older than time, but its surviving features had the air markings of Christian construction. I couldn't really tell exactly much more other than that. I stepped into what must have been a sanctuary. Some wooden rafters, consisting of entire logs that were still stretched out overhead, just kind of like broken ribs, but they were being held up by growing vines and woody tendrils. Where an altar should have been, there was a statue that I barely recognized as the Virgin Mary. apparently set up as a shrine. The statue was so worn with time and weather that the face was barely even discernible. There was something very off-putting about it, though. The eye sockets appeared a little too empty, and the mouth crooked. I don't know if it was by erosion or what. It looked so decayed and diseased. My Catholic upbringing moved me to pray at this image so that I could acknowledge before God that this figure of Our Lady was as legitimate as any other. No sooner had I finished my prayer, fat yellow maggots began pouring out of the face, and there was a slight scratch of stone chipping, and the statue's mouth burst open to allow more maggots to flow. My mind was grasping at this sort of rational explanation. I don't know. Maybe they weren't maggots, possibly termites. All that level-headed thinking fled me when I heard a low voice begin sobbing. The voice sounded distorted, as if it were mocking the sound of human weeping. Look, I didn't take time to thoroughly investigate. Either I was having an hallucinogenic breakdown, or this was some very bad juju. I didn't want any part of this at all, and I got out of there as soon as I could. I now have frequent, reoccurring nightmares of that old church, as if that maggot-spewing statue, or whatever it was, made an effort to follow me, even in my dreams. Still, hands down, one of the most disturbing things I've ever found while hiking or being out in the woods. I have a husky. He is huge, and we have to be careful, as he doesn't really like, well, anything or anyone, except us. He can easily put his paws on my shoulder, and has accidentally knocked my wife over before trying to give her a cuddle. To us, he's a baby. He might nearly suffocate us when he wants to sit on the couch with us, but I'm confident he would never harm us. He's too protective. He can't be in the yard when the mail comes. He goes nuts if somebody knocks on the door. Honestly, you get the picture. We are responsible owners, though. He very rarely comes off his leash, unless we are somewhere with no one else around. Which was why he was able to run when we took him into some thick woods a short drive away. He was having a great time, sniffing and peeing, as dogs seem to do, and I heard him make a noise I never heard. The dog that will growl and bark at anything, no matter how big or scary. I have never heard him whine or whimper. Not like this. So we ran over towards the trees he'd gone into, thinking he must have ran into some thicket and got hurt, or some briar. And we find him on the floor shaking, tail between his legs, whining, full submission and fear. Something moved in the trees not too far in front of us, and made a growling noise, and ran back towards where we left the car. We followed him back, and he was scraping at the door, trying to get in. He was shaking all the way home. He was fine after a day or so, and we checked him for injuries and couldn't see anything visible. He wasn't sick, just terrified. We honestly have no idea what he saw in those trees, but it scared him and all of us to death. To this day, I don't know what the hell we saw,